Hey everyone. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about COVID recovery as a low brass player. So this is an experience that unfortunately I had to go through recently. About 6 weeks ago, I tested positive for COVID, and I am fully vaccinated, so I'm sure that that affected my experience of it a bit, and I know that everyone's experience is different. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience and then how I coped with coming back to the instrument during and after that. So for me, what happened was it started with a sore throat, and then it went into nose stuff, stuffy nose, runny nose, and then eventually that morphed into coughing, and that coughing stayed with me for quite a while. It was a really not that type of cough that I have had for many years, and maybe even 2 weeks in, I was still kind of having the experience of like waking up in the middle of the night just with a coughing fit, like waking me up. So that didn't really go away until about 3 weeks after getting COVID. Although I had been testing negative since like the 5th day after getting it, that cough and that discomfort really stayed with me. And 3 weeks is about when they say online that if you're still experiencing those symptoms, you should see a doctor. So it turned out to be just around then for me that I kind of came out of that. But what I decided to do was, well, I was at home, I was staying away from people. I didn't want to not practice. I wanted to practice. But I knew that it was going to be a little bit uncomfortable, and I was really feeling it in my lungs. So I decided to do something that I haven't really done much in the past couple of years, which is play the exact same thing every day. Normally, my warm-up and fundamentals routine is something that I cycle through different exercises, and I just kind of make a point not to do the same thing every day. But for the purposes of turning this into a bit of an experiment, I decided to play the same thing every day. And so what I wanted to use for that was the 20-minute warm-up book by Michael Davis. This book is one that I have had for a while, and for whatever reason, I haven't actually used it much as a, beginning to end warm-up routine. I have used pieces of it and exercises from it many times, especially with students. There are a lot of creative lip flexibilities in this book. So if I need to put a lip flexibility in front of a student that I'm pretty sure they haven't seen before, I will often go to this book. So there's a lot of things that I appreciate within it, but for whatever reason, it hadn't been my actual go-to warm-up routine. So the book has tracks that go along with it that are played by Gene Picorni, which is pretty cool. But I don't usually play with the tracks because the book, at least my version of it, is based in B flat. So there's a couple extra versions of each exercise that I like to do to sort of complete it in C tuba. But what I did do was use a metronome, and to kept that metronome exactly as what was written in the book for every exercise. So today I'm going to take you through some of those exercises, what gave me trouble, what didn't give me trouble, and why, and what I did about it. I won't be putting the metronome on today because I have to film this on my phone. I'm not in my usual environment for making videos. I'm at home / moving for the summer, which is why you have the beautiful background of cars going by on my street. But hopefully that still gets us through here. So this book begins with an exercise called Air It Out, which I really appreciate because I think for me as a tuba player, but a lot of low brass players, the first note that we generally play when we pick up the instrument is probably that low C or low B flat. And this exercise is what I would call like an inside out lip flexibility. It starts in the middle of your range and then it goes outward from there. So I kind of like it as a starting point, and it has been helpful during this process. That exercise alone was kind of a stretch for me when I first came back to playing, which, by the way, was about 5 days into having COVID. On that 5th day when I started to test negative, I started practicing, and I mean, probably like 8 out of every 10 breaths was okay, but then, 2 of those breaths would just send me into like a fit of coughing, which is kind of annoying. But that was happening to me a bit while playing this. And one thing that's a common theme is that I was glad that I was using the metronome and not the track, because sometimes I needed to insert a little bit more rest than what was actually written in the part. So I enjoyed this exercise for that, sort of starting in the middle of your range and then working out from there. The first exercise that I really had a lot of trouble with was the second one in the book, which is called Sound. It's just a very simple long tones exercise, and on a good day, on a normal day for me, I wouldn't find it terribly challenging. It's another one that I like to put in front of students because maybe they haven't seen it before. Also, a lot of the long tones that I have done in the past, like I'm very familiar with crescendo, decrescendo. Oftentimes I'm doing it at the Mike Roylance 55 instead of 66. So this is, I think, a little bit more approachable of a long tone exercise, but, I'll play an example in A again here. That's something that was not happening for me in my first week post-COVID, and especially not only 2 beats of rest in between the long tones. So I did have to sometimes just adjust the rest a little bit, but like all warm-up exercises, a lot of these, I'm not viewing them as something that I need to get perfect today, especially when recovering from something like COVID. I'm using them as a check-in point. So that's something that, I've always said to students, that was told to me by teachers, but this was one time when I really felt myself needing to check in on that concept and make sure that I remember that these are just check-ins, not the end-all be-all. They're there for the purpose of measuring progress. Another exercise that I want to point out in here is the extended slurs, number 4. This is yet another good creative lip flexibility, and one of the things that I appreciated about it during this time was that it's extensive, it's extended, but at any given time, you only have to be playing for 7 beats at a time. So, this was something that I felt like was helpful to me because I could manage the amount of playing. And even as I got into the lower valve combinations, I could manage the amount of playing that I was doing. And that was helping me to get that flexibility work in. I also think this is a good one for your ear, to be able to hear the different intervals and place, especially that top interval when you get there. The next exercise that I had a good amount of trouble with during this time was number 5, basic flex. Again, this is another really good flexibility, but I had trouble with it with the lower valve combinations. So it's not meant to be played super slow, which is nice, but I would get into like F and E. And that, what I just did, was not happening for me in my first couple weeks of playing during this recovery. So one of the reasons why that's true is just simple kind of the physics of the instrument. As I'm playing my lower valve combinations like F and E, my air is going through more tubing. It takes more tubing, to create the note, and therefore more air to fill that up. So it's already an air challenge. And so what this brings me to is a concept that, pretty much for me, how I look at it, when you're having trouble just getting enough air, having enough air to finish the phrase that you're working on, I suppose you could play softer, and I'm sure that I have done that throughout this process at several times. But Generally speaking, in my experience, there are two different tracks that we can approach and look at in order to increase our ability to play for longer. One of those tracks is we can try to take in more air. Our lung capacity at any given time is basically fixed. You can't really increase your capacity. You can decrease your capacity if you decide to smoke or something like that, but you can't really increase your capacity. You can increase the amount of air that you're taking in. So for example, that breathing gym exercise where you breathe in and then sip, that's a really great exercise for sort of teaching yourself, no, you can take in a little bit more air and then you can let that air out. So that is one track that we usually approach in order to gain maybe more playing time per breath, but that was not working for me during this time because, if I were to breathe all the way in and then take those sips, that's when the coughing would start and I would have trouble with that. So that brings me to track number 2. And normally these would be two things that we're kind of working on simultaneously, but for me, I kind of had to be mainly working on track 2, which is become more efficient so that the air that you can take in lasts longer. I believe Arnold Jacobs said that if you look at the entire playing mechanism as a car, then the air is the gasoline and the lips are the motor. So we need to make sure, especially if our lung capacity is diminished, that we're not operating like a 1985 Buick. We need to be operating a little bit more like a Prius, which is what I drive, incidentally. So I was using buzzing for that. Not a ton of buzzing, but I would have trouble with something like that. And then I would buzz it or use the burp or something like that. Now, anybody who's used buzzing as a tool in practice knows that it's kind of a short-term solution. Like the effects of it don't last forever. That's why you kind of have to keep coming back to it. But for me, it was one way in which I was able to kind of stay sane during this time, because it's not fun to be playing exercises that normally you would be able to get through without any problem. This makes it a little bit more manageable, and it makes you have that actual measurable progress that you can see in the moment. The next exercise that gave me a ton of trouble is number 7, interval flexibility. Yet another one of these great lip flexibilities. You'll see that there are breath marks written in there, but during this time I was not getting anywhere near that, even that final 8th note. That type of continuity of air wasn't really happening for me at that point. So I would more likely be about, I'll keep going a bit. I would be taking a breath maybe on the bar line, maybe 2 breaths, and then as I got down to the lower partials, kind of just breathing wherever I needed to breathe. And part of this, again, for me is when you're doing these exercises, you always need to identify to yourself, what's the point of this exercise? So to me, if I can play this all through in one breath, that would be great. But that wasn't happening. So what I had to really make sure of is, what's the actual challenge of this exercise? For me, the challenge of this exercise is that the upward end of that slur. So, okay, you need to breathe, that's fine. But make sure that the places that you're choosing to breathe are preserving that challenge. So it's not that hard for me to breathe, between the lower note and the upper note. That makes it easier for me. So as I often say in lessons with students, like, none of this is about making our lives easier. It's about making your life harder. So if I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna to take that breath on the bar line or in between, you know, from a high note to low note, just to maintain the challenge of this. And yes, sometimes that means that, like, if I were playing with the track, I would have fallen behind. So, you know, the metronome is helpful, but, you know, every now and then there was an extra beat in there for extra rest, in order to get more air. There are several other really great exercises in this book, and they get more complex. For example, there's one called interval attacks. This one was easier for me to do because it's not about the continuity of air, it's just about attacks. And this one made me feel a little bit better during COVID recovery because I was like, okay, my articulation is still there, I can do it. And I really like doing this exercise in C on this tuba, both as written and then down the octave. So I would be taking those little breaths, you know, kind of practice for taking those unobtrusive breaths between notes. And then doing that down an octave would take more air, but I would feel like I could do it because I could take as many breaths as I needed. There's a really great exercise in the end of this book called Super Ninths, which is based in the whole tone scale, which if you have seen this channel before, you know that I really like the whole tone scale and using it to warm up or to as part of my fundamentals routine. So this one is probably the only one that I really had to step away from the metronome, at least at first, in order to be able to play it. Again, I hadn't really been playing it regularly before this, so I had to get used to the notes and the interval of ninth and then get a little bit more comfortable with it. As you get up in the range, it actually the breathing gets a little bit easier, but I was taking it pretty slow and using it as just practice moving through the partials of the instrument, which is another thing that I find I really need as part of my daily routine. So this one is a very good practice for, well, you know, there's not exactly breath marks written in, but you got to breathe all the time. So it's kind of good practice for those little sit breaths that you need to take. The other thing I'll note about this exercise is that in the euphonium version of this book, it's written slurred. So I like to do both. And so that's what I did with this one, just sort of used it as, you know, just kind of free time. I eventually incorporated the metronome, but I think it's more important at first to just fill up each note with air. And that was not happening at triplet at 66 for me at the very beginning. The book closes out with a high range control exercise and then a pedal range exercise, which is a very nice sort of way to balance out the ending of the routine. Neither of them gave me too much trouble because I was inserting breaths as needed. And so the only real trouble that I had was sort of at the very beginning when I was just coughing and just having trouble getting a breath to begin with. But I like the ending of this because it does take you to, you know, it's sort of the extremes of range, and we should all be doing that, you know, at some point every day. So that's the routine that I was doing. And what I found was that if I used a metronome every day, there was measurable progress. And I appreciated that and being able to see that. You know, if you're taking lessons, then, you know, theoretically your teacher is the one who measures that progress and who tells you that things are getting better. But you also need recordings, and you need the metronome and things so that you can reinforce that for yourself. And show that no, things are getting better day to day. This is the first time in a long time that I've done the same routine every day. And it's the first time in a long time that I actually feel like, you know, the amount of progress that I was making was actually very visible because I was coming from such a depleted state. So this is part of kind of what helped me, stay sane and focus during this time. One thing that I'll note is that I am focusing on the big tuba here. I was also playing F tuba and euphonium during this time, but they didn't give me as much trouble as far as you know, just air capacity and usage of air went. But I was also playing things on other instruments. It's just that this is pretty much always how I start my day, and so that's what I was using as sort of that measuring stick, was the toughest possible challenge for me. So I hope that none of you have to go through this, but I'm sure that many of you have. At least now, one silver lining is that I feel like I can relate a little bit more to students who go through this at some point and maybe have a couple of words of advice on it and that progress. But of course, everybody's experience is different. I'd be interested in hearing, from any of you, whether you've had an experience with this, a different experience, or any trouble with this. One thing that I didn't mention as a symptom, because it wasn't really as much a physical symptom, was like I was definitely in a brain fog for like at least 2 weeks. And so some of this stuff, I know that I did it every day. I'm not sure if I really remember it. But that's of course another element of this whole thing. So of course, we have to just be kind to ourselves and try to get ourselves better in whatever way works for us. But yeah, again, I'd be interested in hearing other people's experience about this, because this experiment for me, I think, was successful in the sense that I recovered, but I did not recover as fast as I wanted to. And that was a bummer for me. And if I hadn't had this measurable kind of little mini successes day by day, I think it would have been very demoralizing. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. And take care, stay healthy out there.